Hello and welcome to DocTalk, our educational and informational conversation series. I'm Jayashree Mani, clinical nutritionist, and I'm with PERQUE Integrative Health. We have here Dr. Russell Jaffe, who's also the owner and founder of PERQUE Integrative Health. This is where the LRA by ELISA Act, the gold standard of ELISA Act testing, delayed allergy testing, and PERQUE nutraceuticals come together. And we have here with us our guest, Dr. Erik Peper, who is a world-renowned expert in biohealth feedback and stress management, as well as holistic health, who's written numerous books and scientific articles on this subject. So welcome, Dr. Peper and Dr. Russell Jaffe. We look forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be present. I feel very honored to be together with my colleague and friend.
Indeed, and we've been looking forward to this for some time. In fairness to our audience, because you and I could catch up for most of the morning, which would be delightful, but in fairness to our audience, if we could, let's jump in on a very common situation about which you have a very clear, helpful point of view, and that is in this day and age when many of us are in front of screens, within days or weeks or months, you begin to notice tightness in your neck, in your shoulders, and your paraspinal muscles. Your eyes, you begin to notice eye strain that maybe you didn't have or didn't notice before. Where is this coming from, and how come so many people are caught up in that today, whereas 20, 30 years ago, I personally didn't hear much about it?
It truly is almost an epidemic, and it is automatic in that process of sitting at the computer. And there are a couple of reasons for it. So let me do an interesting way we started and found this out initially. About 30 years ago, a client came up to me, referred by another colleague who was going on vacation and who had neck, shoulder, arm problems. And the person had just started working on a computer and has had the best ergonomist who adjusted all the equipment so the eyes were arranged, so the screen was right at the top of the eyebrow level, the chair was perfectly done, the arms could be next to the body and about 90 degrees, the hands could be resting on the keyboard, and despite the ergonomic adjustments, the person's symptoms got worse. And that was sort of questioning, how come? And then we monitored the person with biofeedback. That means we could monitor the muscle tensions of their shoulder, of their arms. And then we observe something which almost everybody does at the computer without any awareness. When you're sitting at the computer, you often raise your shoulder slightly when you're mousing. You don't know it because it's a very little tension. And you do it statically for a long time without any awareness. Then when you get more interest in the text, or because as your eyes get tired, you start looking a little more at the screen, and notice what you just saw in my body posture. If I start to go a little more forward, and then if I look at my spine becomes more like a letter C. I scrunch more. And if I sit in this position for a long time, then these muscles compress the spine, they tighten, and then we get the achiness. Let me do that by an example for the listener, if that's okay. What I'd like you all to do for a moment is just lift your right knee about an inch up so the foot is away from the floor. It's not a very big movement. You're lifting your foot up for about an inch from the floor, and just hold it there. And keep holding it there. And how long do you think you could hold it there? Right now, you can already start feeling some sensations going down, a little discomfort building up, not too much yet. And I know some of you can hold it for a long time. It will depend how much I would pay you to do that. But nevertheless, let it go. Notice you tightened this muscle for a little while. That is really what is happening in our neck and shoulders, except we are totally unaware of that. That's the real key. And now go back to your thinking of your thigh again and leg. Remember when you go outside and walk, some of you can walk for miles, some of you run for miles. you have no problem. How come you have no problem? Because when you run, the same muscles get activated, except during every step, they tighten and they relax. They tighten and relax. When you tighten the muscles, you tend to cut the blood flow by about 80%. When they relax, the blood flow can go through it, nutrients come in, waste products get taken away, and the system can regenerate. So the quickest rule at the computer is to take many breaks. They're often called micro breaks, movement breaks. And this was already observed in Norway many years ago in a study where you observed people who were working at a candy factory. And the people were hired, you monitored their neck and shoulder tension while they were working. And then as they worked, their work was really to move their arm back and forth without knowing. And then the people analyzed the data and they followed the people for 2 years. And then they found out they could literally predict who would belong to the risk group who would get sick. And in fact, at that point, the label was often called repetitive strain injury. It's not really that, but that's the label for it. And then he found out it wasn't how much tension you were using, it was how many micro breaks you had in the movements. That meant when you moved your arm, when you brought it back, it relaxed. You know, and these concepts we have really just published in our book, which I think everyone ought to look at, called, techstress. I may make comments about that later. But let me guide you through another exercise to really get that concept totally, as much as I can. I'd like you to take your mouse or an imaginary mouse in your hand. And then in a moment, I'm going to ask you to draw with the mouse the letters of your street address, starting with the last letter. So if my street address is Derby Street, then I draw the letter T with the mouse, then I would click, then I would draw the letter E with the mouse, and then I would click, and the next letter E, so I'm going backwards, okay? And I'd like you to do this, that the height of each letter is only about, a quarter of an inch, even less than a centimeter or so in height, very small. So if you're ready, now just start drawing with your mouse those letters very quickly. Do it quicker, don't make a mistake. Remember, you're going backwards. Do it quicker, really small. Do it quicker. Notice as you're doing this, what happened? Notice how your body stiffened. Notice how you held your breath, how your shoulders tightened. And yet we were totally unaware of this. So that is almost a thematic part of how we are operating. And that's how we really started and observed. And then the question is, how can people become aware that they're doing this? That's one. For that, a tool such as biofeedback or monitoring posture is really useful. Two, what are behavioral things we can do? Because when I get captured by the computer, I should be captured because it triggers evolutionary survival patterns. We forget this. It's like when I'm walking through the jungle, the savannah, thousands of years ago and generations ago, something was in the periphery and there was a shift in movement. I look at that, I freeze, I tighten. I don't, at that moment, and I do this automatically because if I didn't do that, I would be lunch. And so this really is, it's intrinsic, and basically much of social media, much of our computer stimulation trigger these old survival mechanisms, keep evoking it, and now they become an evolutionary trap. So when I'm sitting here and I'm working, and any mother knows this if they have, or mother or father knows this, who has children, especially boys who are playing computer games, you know, the child is playing the game and now it's dinner time and the mother or father calls or the parent calls and says, okay, it's time to stop. Let's have dinner. And the child says, I'll be there in a moment. And a half an hour later, they're still playing. How come? Because they're captured. And that is really evoking the survival. As long as there's change on the screen, it re-evokes you to get engaged. We don't realize that, but there's a major cost in that if we do that too long. There's nothing wrong with being excited. There's nothing wrong with being involved. The problem, if I stay at that aroused state for a long time, then the body is really, you could say, continually prepped almost for fight, flight. And that would
Right.
slowly over time suppress our immune system. It puts us at risk for all kinds of illnesses.
Well, let
The
me
key
jump
is,
in on that, if I may, because in addition to what almost all of us have been conditioned into, fight or flight, there is a third option, which is fortitude.
Mhm.
And I think what you've just given us are examples of how to build fortitude, resilience, a certain amount of gratitude that comes along with that. And in our recommendations, we're very specific that whether it's your clock or your app, something should give you 5 minutes every hour to get up and stretch. Now, I personally prefer to wiggle. Other people prefer to do Tai Chi or Hatha Yoga, Prana Yoga, breathing and stretching. And my friend and mentor, Moshe Feldenkrais, is Kvelling. That's a Yiddish word for being very proud of what you just not just said in such an articulate way, in such a succinct way, but also in such a practical way. Because as he and you pointed out, awareness through movement is possible, especially if you're willing to pay attention to those micro motions that most of us suppress or sublimate. I'm not even quite sure what the word is, but lack of awareness is a very human quality until we cultivate greater awareness through practices such as what you've just offered.
well, your point is really well taken. We want to re-evoke awareness. And there's a paradox, because if I'm aware of my body and there's a tiger out there, my gosh, I would be eaten. So at that moment, when I'm reacting to the outside world, it's more challenging to be aware for survival. And
When
yet
you say tiger out there, I will tell you what I felt and what I heard was my mother.
yes, you made the exquisite point that there is no difference, and that's the error we make, between the actual stimulus out there or the internal voices or memories. We forget that thoughts and memories evoke the same body responses. A classic way you can easily experience that is all you do. If you don't do this when you're driving, definitely.
Right.
But if you're sitting, just for a moment, get comfortable, make yourself really comfortable. I'm going to guide you through a tiny exercise to make this point. I want you to just press your ankles together, your knees together, your buttocks together. Bring your arms up, make them really tight. Make a fist very tight, tighter and tighter and tighter. Wrinkle your face. Are you holding your breath? And most likely, yes. Let it go. Relax. Let's do it again without holding your breath. So bring your ankles together, your knees together, tighten your buttocks, pull your anus right to your belly button, really bring your arms up, make a fist, tighten, wrinkle your face, and then just hold that tension and let it go. And now, as you're sitting there with your eyes closed, for a moment, just imagine a big yellow lemon. You know, the sign, really the two chubby ends, the really big yellow lemon. Then I'd like you to imagine putting that lemon on a cutting board, get a knife in your hand, and imagine cutting this lemon in half. And as you're cutting it, feel the tension in your arm, feel the droplets of lemon juice against your skin. After you've cut the lemon in half, put the knife to the side, pick up one of the half lemons, look at it. The outer yellow rind, the pale whitish inner rind. The envelopes contain the lemon juice, the half-cut pits. Now get a glass, and now with your hand, squeeze that half lemon so the juice goes into the glass. Feel the tension in your fingers as you're doing it. Really squeeze it. You see the juice going into the glass. Put that half lemon to the side. pick up the other half lemon, really squeeze that, squeeze it, get the lemon juice into the glass, feel the droplets of lemon juice sprinkling against your skin. After you have squeezed that one, put it to the side. Now take this glass, hold the glass in your hand, bring it to your lips, feel the coolness of the glass against your lower lip. Tilt the glass, feel the lemon juice against your lips, open your mouth, tilt the glass more. Now taste and swallow the lemon juice. And yes, you can spit out the pits. I think that's enough.
May I offer a post anecdote just to reinforce what you just said? In Ayurvedic lore, when Ayurvedic doctors would walk by a town to decide whether people needed their help, they would look to see if there were lemons with pits. Because if people ate the pits, didn't spit the pits out, as you correctly suggested, they'd end up with digestive disorders and constipation and irritability.
That's
and
great.
lack of restorative sleep. Yes, it's one of the favorite anecdotes that Dr. Ramamurti Mishra used to say or tell at his Ananda ashram in New York State. And I went to debunk him and became his acolyte and then became his doctor.
That is so great. Just to finish the story, because I think it's getting, I think what you experienced, or at least when we do this with students, clients, professionals, about 98% of the people will have felt an increase in saliva when they did this imagery. Now, you think about, oh, well, that's just fun. But now ask yourself, what does this mean? This really says that what I'm imaging, what I'm thinking, or what visual pollution I'm putting into my brain, the images, have a direct effect on my body. So that is the other part, which is part of this techstress. What are you putting into your body? How are you also reacting or evoking? Because it isn't just the screen. It is your self-stress you induce. I need to perform and finish the task. Or the external stress or self-perceived stress of my supervisor, my boss, pushing. And so that is and those are issues which one has to learn skills for. One of the big physiological parts, which we forget, is that our breathing really gets compromised both in the position and when we give this response. When we give this fight, flight, or fear response, we tend to often tighten our stomach unknowingly to protect ourselves. It's this protective motion. We don't know it. We don't even see it amperly, and yet we do. And when you observe people, you see that their breathing truly, from my perspective, is compromised. Name their breathing often quickly, mainly in their chest. And there's nothing wrong with doing that sometimes. It's healthy. It's if it becomes more a predominant pattern. And then if you look at it, you realize the abdomen is not moving anymore. And it's much more difficult to make the abdomen move during breathing, because when you inhale, you would expect the stomach to get bigger. Just think how a little baby is breathing. You know, the big Buddha belly just moves in and out. That's really how we all want to breathe effortlessly. But instead, we don't see any movement in our stomach. Part of that is because we have designer's gene syndrome, although much less now with Zoom, where we are having a tight girdle on. Well, girdle we don't use anymore today. It's called a belt. But still, it's the same thing that happened in the 19th century when the many women wore these very tight waist constriction corsets. And then they developed an illness called neurasthenia. Most interesting. This illness was all, if you look at the symptoms, they're the symptoms of anxiety, panic, irritable bowel, you name it, except they also got often medicalized, they got medications, they got surgery. And all that was is because their waist was so constricted that there was no movement. What we truly forget in breathing, if you think about it, if you think of that baby again, moving back and forth, we only think of breathing in terms of gas exchange, oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide coming out. That's only one small part of it. Because breathing, the movement of the diaphragm, that's a big flat muscle that separates the abdomen from the chest. And when that muscle flattens, it's like a dome and it goes down, then air is allowed to go in. But when it goes down, it needs to displace the abdomen. So the abdomen would expand and widen. The interabdominal pressure would go down. And then when you exhale in the vertical position, the abdomen would come in, that would push that diaphragm up like a piston, letting the air go out. And when you do this, breathing does much more than gas exchange. It is the pump that allows the lymph and venous return of blood to be circulating through the abdomen, a total forgotten piece of wisdom in a sense.
It's
And
called
so
the splanchnic. It's called the splanchnic circulation for those who are more technical, but absolutely. And in our 72 minutes a day of self-care, that's what we say is all you need is to devote 5% of your time, 72 minutes. Within that, there are 5 minutes of abdominal breathing twice a day.
yes.
And in a relatively short period of time in our observational community-based studies, this is not holding people's hands. This is just asking them to report on what they do and what they observe. In as short as weeks to a month, you change the breathing pattern towards what you're saying, one that adds life to years and years to life, because it is much more than just exchanging some gases with regard to the importance of breath throughout the body, especially the abdomen, because visceral fat, for those who are concerned about appearance and fat proportion, we want a little bit of oil, a little bit of fat in the background in case something happens and we need to call for energy. But most of us live to eat. We don't eat to live. We don't pay enough attention to the quality of what we see, because as you know, and I just like to reinforce, digestion begins with what you see. And I actually think digestion begins with what you choose to bring together to see, as called the meal. And in our case, it's mostly whole, minimally heated. We have no edible oils and no sugar. We're sweet enough as we are, so we don't need added sugar. And edible oils are, in a sense, a cause for concern. As soon as you separate the oil from the protective seed or not, air, oxygen, now becomes your enemy. It's called rancidity. It's long been known, and there's a lot of chemistry that goes into masking, fooling the tongue and the body and the brain to create what's called the crave factor. That is actually something that food technologists know about. And the crave factor is that you can addict most people to fat, to simple sugar, sodium, the wrong sugar, and the wrong processing. And what I from Beatrice Trunter was shopping at the market. That's in a box, can, or package, be skeptical. And if there's any word on it that you don't know from common sense, then just pass.
Well, let me add to this in a different way. So one about, let me make two comments about this. One about the breathing more and one about diet. I'll come back to that for a sec, or foods. On the breathing, that if you observe many people when they are slightly vigilant, their breathing tends to be shallow. And then if they stay that same way, they do not get that circulation in their abdomen. And what you see is common to almost all people with GI distress, gastrointestinal distress, irritable bowel, acid reflux. It makes a difference. These many common is that the abdomen doesn't move. And what we have observed, I mean, I feel so lucky teaching at San Francisco State, where we have these younger students, and we have many students who have had irritable bowel since age 10, or even acid reflux since they were 14. They've had it for years. Nothing worked. They're on medication. They're just miserable. They also can't eat any more foods or whatever. Their social life is constricted. They start practicing this slower breathing. They do more than just that, but they do this slower breathing and observe every time they tend to hold their breath. That is, to what are they reacting, their thoughts or their external world? They check their posture. All of a sudden, they shift their posture back. So they open up more. So in a sense of confidence, they really breathe diaphragmatically. And I've been so impressed that within 4 weeks of just this self-care, their illness fades out. It is, it's not magic, because the distinction is you have to change your life. And imagine how difficult that is for young men and women, when all of a sudden you tell them, wait a minute, you need to wear looser clothing. Your belt is much too tight. Because the reason we hold our abdomen in are multiple. One is, like I said, for fear, for alarm, etc. Two, some people are very emotionally sensitive, so they have learned since the earliest child, any signal that impacts them, they react. That is their life pattern. So it's almost a family pattern. And it didn't mean that their parents were bad or anything like that. They were just more hyper-reactive, in a sense, hypersensitive. Then we have all our social messages. Who would ever want to date me or date you if your stomach bubbled out? So you learn that kind of very self-awareness. Then we have the iatrogenic side effect of surgery or abdominal insults, in a sense, because the moment you have any surgery in the abdomen, you learn one thing: not to move that area. Because when you add stitches, the moment you inhale, the area would stretch, that hurts. You're unaware that you're doing that. You now hold it tight, and that becomes your new pattern for the rest of your life. And I'm so impressed when people shift. Let me give an example on that. I had a young man who came to us who had epilepsy. He had 12 seizures a week. He was diagnosed. He finally, he was on lots of medication. He went to UCSF, and finally said to him, we looked at the EEG. Well, it's psychogenic. We can't do anything for you. Except the young man has 12 seizures a week. He's terrified. We see him, we look at his diet, and that's the critical part I want to emphasize as well. And what was he doing? He was a college student. What was he eating? Sugars. He drank power drinks. He used alcohol to quiet down at night. You look at that and you say, wait a minute. None of the healthcare professionals ever looked at that from a young man. I was appalled. So one of the things we did was to encourage him to change his diet. He really did. Two, he was only breathing in his chest about 24 times a minute, very quickly. He had very sweaty hands. He was massively aroused. So then we taught him slower breathing. He could see it on the screen, because it's by seeing it, you believe it. Otherwise, it's just words. He then practiced this at home, which is most interesting. He came back the next session and he said, but it was so powerful. He said, for at least half the times when I could feel the seizure starting, I would do the breathing and I could abort the seizures. In 2 months, he became seizure free, and he's now off all medication. But I want to point out more than that for him, because he changed his diet massively. So he got rid of all his simple sugars, because there's this relationship of simple sugars and hyperventilation I won't talk about right now, but there's an interaction. It's critical. He put himself on a healthy diet, and then he also changed his posture. And I want to talk about that, because when I sit at the computer, and it's critical for that, I collapse like this very quickly. Even if the best arranged chairs, after a while, we just collapse. Now, think of a couple of things that happen. When my head goes forward, the weight of this head is now over the fulcrum. Now the equivalent forces on my neck are 60 pounds, like this. The classical cell phone look means my spine has to work and gets compressed by 60 pounds. If I'm totally erect, it's only about 12 pounds. Okay, so that's one. Two, when I slouch, the space between the lower part of my ribs and my belly and my pubis, my hips, is much less. The area gets compressed. So there's always pressure. So that forces me to breathe. Three, when we tend to get fearful, we go like this. Now the concept is that posture affects others. We look at people in their posture, we impact who we are. But more importantly, our posture affects us in at least two different ways. One, it literally changes the physiology that puts us more at risk. And by the shallower breathing at least, tightening of the pectoralis area a little bit for protection without knowing, the head going forward, causing compression in the cervical area, which may affect brain circulation in the end, and is a contributing part for headaches. And then it also affects our mood and our thoughts. We often think only in most of psychology, we think thoughts and emotions in here affects our body. What we don't realize is that our body changes our thoughts and emotions. And so by having a posture by which I'm collapsed, I tend to be more depressed. And we see this massive increase right now, doubling or tripling of depression and anxiety rates during the COVID era. And that's partly due for many reasons, lack of social support. And I would want to argue that it may even be that so many of us have reduced physical activity.
Right.
And I know that for myself, I normally, when I go to my university, I walk to the BART, that's our transportation system, and I walk from the station to the university. I walk up and down, and I do 13,000 steps without me doing any exercise. Now at my home, I do 2,000 steps if I'm lucky, unless I now have to force myself. So that's one is movement, that's one. But posture goes back to that position. Think about when you are depressed. What is the posture of people who are depressed? Are they looking like this? Not all, it's never 100%. They are more collapsed. Their energy is lower, they're collapsed. And so what you can see is that when you put yourself in that position, possibly, you would evoke those memories. So I like to do a little exercise to make that point. So it's really driven home how powerful posture is, and then what you can do about it, because that's the usefulness. So what I like you to do is just sit slouched, look down, your back's a little bit like the classical cell phone look, where we spend literally hours at times, or my students even do their whole papers. They write their papers on a cell phone because some of them are too poor or don't have enough economic support to have a computer. Sit in this position. Now I'd like you to just evoke hopeless, helpless, powerless, defeated memories, one after the other. So you're looking down, you're evoking hopeless, helpless, powerless, defeated memories. And just keep doing that, one after the other. And now, without changing your position, stay slouched, looking down. I'd like you to evoke empowering, optimistic memories, one after the other. That's optimistic, empowering memories. And now what I'd like you to do is sit up, make yourself straight. You have almost this hollowness in the back. Really let your hands be open. Look slightly up. The palms are almost open. Look slightly up, not like all the way like that, but sort of upward. And then evoke only hopeless, helpless, powerless, defeated memories in this position. And I can do this for a much longer time, but we'll do it for shortness. And now shift and evoke only optimistic and empowering memories. So now you're thinking optimistic and empowering memories. Pull those up. And I think that's enough. And I think if you're probably like the hundreds of students we have done, adults, clients, where we have done this as both research and published it, what you experienced, that it was just slightly, it was easier in the down position to evoke hopeless, helpless memories. And for some people, they get totally captured by it. They're totally, the moment they put in that position, they get captured. Then it was just harder to evoke optimistic and positive memories. And in fact, when we looked at the EEG, the brainwave activity, with my colleague Yi-Mei Lin in Taichung, in Taiwan, then you see the brain literally has to work harder to access these positive memories. While in the upward position, you could still, most people can still evoke the hopeless memories, but as if you're more distant from it, slightly further away, you're not captured the same way. And it was easy to evoke the optimistic, empowering memories. Now, when you think of this, like I said, as I started earlier, how do we sit at the computer? We may start upright, but then I get tired because I haven't moved for a while. And then I start slouching and slouching and slouching. Now if you have any history of depression, that's the real key. Then this posture is a very powerful trigger to lower your energy and evoke more hopeless memory. It's classically conditioned. If you have zero history of defeat, zero history of hopelessness, posture makes no difference, by the way. I just don't know that many people who are like that. Okay. But since we all have been sitting, why don't you all get up for a moment? It's unimportant. I know it's hard to do, but just get up. And just for a moment, take it and just really reach up, reach up, reach up, reach up, smile, reach up. Great. You can do it sitting. And now imagine that you are there are all kinds of plants growing and there are lovely flowers, and you have to reach and pick the flowers to make a bouquet. So I'm picking this flower on the top. I put it into my hand. I pick this other flower. I put that into the bouquet. Oh, there's one near my knees. I pick that one. I put it into a bouquet. There's one behind me. I pick that one, and I get this lovely bouquet. I look at this bouquet of flowers, and then I think of someone who I really love or like, and I hand them these flowers with a smile. And now ask yourself, how do you feel? Notice your energy went up. You maybe even you thought the imagery was maybe silly, but even the act of being silly, you slightly smile and you feel better. We forget that when we configure our body to be empowered, to be positive, it in fact reconfigures our brain. They're not separate. And you can just see this also in athletics. When a person wins in the Olympics, yay, both arms go up. And they go up even when people are born blind. It is an innate mechanism. And when someone loses and they feel defeated, because some people can come in second place or third, and they still think they did their personal best, they're totally happy. But the ones who feel they should have won and feel defeated, you see their body collapse and there's no energy left. While the person who won and they went up like this, after they had run their marathon, all of a sudden they have energy to just run like a maniac around the track one more time, while they amply dropped over the finish line moments before. We forget how powerful posture changes us. Now, how can you be aware of it? Because sitting at the computer or at home watching another series on streaming videos. How do I sit? Well, I sit on the couch. How does the couch make me sit? I slouch. I lean back. So the key is, and here's what Russ pointed out earlier, to be aware. It's very challenging to be aware because you get captured in social environments. So what you want to do is configure your world to help you. So you don't have to remember. So what I've done on my couch, in fact, that's true for myself, I have a little pillow that I put sort of right where my kidneys are almost. So I put my bottom all the way back. Then I put this little round pillow where my kidneys are. Then when I lean back, I automatically am in the open position more. I don't have to think about it too much. On my computer, I've arranged my screen that same way. So it's somewhat high. It's about the top of this larger screen is at eye level, and I'm sitting up. And then even though I still will start collapsing when I'm going to read the screen sometimes, especially when you do Excel or all those other fine details, then I need to check what's going on. That's called the ergonomics. In a very broad picture, does it mean my vision? I need other glasses.
You may
It's
want to
possible.
have functional optometry for
Yes.
what are called industrial or continuous refraction. And then if you have, like me, I inherited my father's eyes and his hair. I got a good deal, but I'm very nearsighted. To the point where when I just had my lenses replaced of necessity and choice, they could not use the new silicone lenses because if your retina does detach, which I don't recommend, and I recommend nourishing it every day so that it will stay attached to you. But if you would, any comments about Milton Traeger's system and his students like Dean Juhan and his book, Job's Body and Spiritual Aspects of Body Work, and neuroreflex, now that we have rediscovered that the vagus has always been a bidirectional highway. And it wasn't too many years ago when I was taught that it only went from the brain to the body, as you said. And now we know that there has never been a disconnection between brain and body or between body and brain. And it's been a communion since there's been brain and body together.
Yes. And the key, I think, there's not even a discussion about it for me. It's like, it's our English language, which says we have, in the joke I often think about, which I tell my students, you go to the psychologist or psychiatrist, they take you from the neck up. You go to the internist, they take you from the neck down. You go to the social worker, they take the connections outside. And you go to the clergy, who takes anything that floats around. The reality is, health is the total enmeshing and interaction. They're never separate one from the other. And now I just think of vision for a moment. When I look at the screen, I'm using mainly the foveal vision. I really forget about the peripheral vision. Remember, I would not survive in a jungle if I were looking only foveally. I need to be perpetually aware of the subtle periphery. And that is very critical stimulation for the eye. And there's some evidence, in fact, that the more you get peripheral stimulation, the less likely will you get glaucoma, in fact.
Yes.
And it makes sense because if you think about it, when I'm doing close-up vision, that's called near visual stress, the cilia muscles around the lens tighten, the eyes have to converge, which puts tension around here, that probably puts constriction around the von Schlempp canals, which would drain the eye of the fluids. So you build up, and that becomes your lifestyle. And we know that young people who only, as babies already, young early, only look at this close vision, which we do at computers, at cell phone, and earlier at books, bookworms, the same thing. If you do that, the eyes are not fixed. They adapt, they grow and change to be functional at that distance. In Singapore, 80% of young people are myopic, nearsighted, not because they were born that way. And if you go to places where people still alternate between far and near distance, and the classic example would be the Bedouins in Israel, for example, who were hired by the military to be their guides, to be the people looking for danger, because these people working in the desert were always looking both far and near, and their vision, even in adulthood, was like not 2020, it was 2010.
And that
And they
was
were
Ted
very,
Williams. Ted Williams, a very famous baseball player that's probably most of our audience doesn't remember, but he had 2010.
Mhm.
Some great athletes, as you said, 2010. But most importantly, people out in the world using their physiology regularly sustain function throughout life.
Yes, as the classic phrase says, use it or lose it.
Great phrase. Great phrase. I look, aside from the trademark, it's a great phrase. On the other hand, I don't happen to agree with the notion of no pain, no gain. I think we can gain without pain if we're willing to let go of fear. If fear is the mind killer, as Yoda used to say. I think that today we have extraordinary challenges, pandemic and related, as you so clearly articulated, and greater opportunity than ever to choose life, to choose health, to evoke healing responses, to make our habits and lifestyle evocative of healthy epigenetics, healthy living, from restorative sleep to relationships, from the fuel or the quality of what we put in our hydration to our attitudes and our activities. And as one who tried for many years to meditate in his mind, I can tell you that's fine, but you still have to get off the couch, however you ergonomically design it, and balance out what you want to retain. If you move, you retain. If you use, you retain. If you abuse, well, you get the consequences of that.
You make me smile so much about the critical part of movement, and that's so. I'm thinking, what can we take home from this in terms of practice? So one, really integrate breaks and movements. I would say every 20 minutes or so. Okay. The question is, how do I remember? There are many apps, but there's a free app, for example, I know of, which you can install in your computer called stretchbreak.com. I get no money for it. It's www.stretchbreak.com. I should have gotten money for it. No, my error. And I put it onto my computer and it pops up. You can adjust it. It pops up every 20 minutes. And then I listen to it. The challenge is when you're working, you say, I'll postpone it. So it takes real training and support. But what is so interesting is we did this with employees at the university, and we were training them. And we had this older man who said, look, what are you talking about? I have no problems. I work in the computer. I finish at 5 o'clock. I have no neck pain. I have no problems at all. So it took us a while to persuade him. But anyway, we finally persuaded him to install this kind of program and to take a break every half an hour or so, just to get up, just a little stretch. Very little. He comes back the next week and he says, with almost this smile, almost an embarrassed smile, there's life after 5. And what he meant was that by the end of the day, instead of being basically exhausted and tired, which he felt was totally normal, he had energy left to do. And that is the big difference. It's just like that little exercise we did when I had you stretch up, your energy went up. And now, so that's one, is that pro. 2, posture. I don't know that I slouch. I really don't. I've become more persuaded how important it is also for students, because we did that same study of collapse, negative thoughts, but now all you do is you do a cognitive task called serial sevens, a little math task. So you ask the people to subtract a number like 7 from 100, that'd be 93, 80, 60, or you can make it more difficult. And you do this in 2 different positions. So you have a large class, half the class collapses, slouches, and the other half class sits up. They then report how difficult it is. Then they switch positions. So it's a nice double, controlled study. The data is overwhelming. I was shocked. that for the students showed distinctly when they were slouched. It was more difficult to do the math task. Much more difficult. Some blanked out totally. And some, obviously, there was very little effect. It was very impressive. He published that study. And then when you looked at the data in detail, there was only one small subgroup for whom there was no effect. And that correlates to the students who you asked beforehand on the questionnaire. Do you have any test anxiety? Do you freeze up on exams? Do you get nervous before class present? The ones who said no all the way across that, I'll call the happy-go-lucky or the uncaring, posture made no difference. But for most successful students, they're not like that. Most of my students, at least, when they come to an exam, they're a bit nervous. How well will they do? Anybody who has that temperament of kind of, performance anxiety in a certain way, in a very positive way even, posture is a big impact. So reconfigure yourself by being empowered, because that tells the brain you can think abstractly. Again, when you collapse and give a defense reaction, you don't need your cortex. You're only ready to run and fight. I'm exaggerating, but in a simplistic way, it really does diminish that. And yet when I'm empowered, then all of a sudden I feel safe and secure and powerful. And then I can have the privilege of thinking more abstractly, of contemplating the future, etc. And so to me, these are simple hints people can do in this. And then breathing is so critical, and the breathing is the link, not just to air exchange, not only just to gastrointestinal movements. It even applies for women who have difficulty in fertility or carrying the baby. The women who learn to breathe more diaphragmatically tend to be able to carry the baby longer, have a slightly higher fertility. And so it's small.
And easier deliveries.
Yes. The key is what can you do yourself to mobilize your health? And there are many factors. So now going all the way back to how we started from the computer, then I would say, take charge of yourself and your environment. 1, configure the basics. I call that ergonomics. Get a chair that offers support, that your feet are flat on the floor. You can sit comfortably. There are lots of material on that. I recommend, much of that we have described in our book. We have all these practices called Stress Tech. Sit there, but remember, even if the chair is perfect, it only gives you the opportunity to sit correctly. You can still sit totally incorrectly. You can still slouch in a perfectly good chair. And if you sit perfectly erect the whole time, you can't do that because you'll get disc pressure increasing and increasing. We are organisms that need to alternate between regeneration and excitation, between movement. So wiggle around, as Russ started to say earlier. You're sitting in the chair, you move every so often. And the more you wiggle and move at times, especially as an adult, but also children, the less likely will you have problems, because every time you move for a moment, you're massaging, the discs almost inside. And you're reducing the muscle tension. Going back to muscle tension, but we forget, we may be tight, as I said earlier, when we're holding our mouse, and I'm unaware of it. If I do a different movement, which the typist used to do without any awareness. People who used to type, they would be sitting, but then what would they do? They have to hit the return. Well, with the select trick, they could use their pinky to hit the return, but then they had to put the paper in. Notice that's a different set of muscles. And then once the page was finished, they took the page, they got up, they had to file it. So embedded in the task was alternation of movement. As much as possible, configure your world where you alternate movement. So each time you pick up your cell phone, put it on speakerphone, stand up and answer the cell phone. A simple task like that, it makes giant differences. Then from an evolutionary perspective, remember, going to sleep, the light needs to be dark. The colors change. In the morning, we have a lot of blue light coming out that wakes us up. It suppresses our melatonin production. Then as the light shifts to sunset and it gets reddish, our melatonin production starts going up. And people are all differently sensitive to this, you know. And then at night,
just to add a footnote to that, we urge people to have enhanced uptake tryptophan that goes where it's needed to serotonin and melatonin.
yes,
We do not urge pharmacology out of physiology. In other words, we don't recommend people swallowing large amounts of melatonin. It's a very powerful molecule.
you want to take
But the
very little,
body,
none at all.
right, the body can make it where it's needed, when it's needed, and use it in a very short period of time. And yes, it's very important, but very, from our point of view, important to do physiology before pharmacology.
Totally. And I support that perspective. And then remember, by going to sleep, what do many people do? Or most of my students, they have their cell phone next to them in the bed.
Right.
They're quickly checking social media.
Right.
And that has two components.
Right.
Or we check our schedule for tomorrow.
Right.
In business. It is this light that hits our eyes that really suppresses melatonin right away.
Absolutely.
That's one part. And we forget that as we go to sleep at night, our brain gets a bit quieter, our thoughts get quieter, and now we get re-stimulated by social media, worries, whatever, and that interferes with sleep as well. So it's really this confluence of both, and we forget that. So the rule, I would say, there's nothing new about this. This is in all spiritual traditions. It makes a difference which one. In the evening, be quieter, be peaceful, read spiritual texts, read unimportant, do or be together, but it's that sense of appreciation that, gosh, a day has passed. I'm so lucky. I'm looking forward. And then the sense is looking forward to the next day. If you dread what you're looking forward to, sleep will be much more disturbed.
A life of quiet desperation is not recommended, but we do include in the process a simple procedure adding baking soda and Epsom salts, salt and soda, maybe with an oil that is aromatic and you like, and you soak for about 20 minutes, 5 minutes of abdominal breathing, 15 minutes of active meditation, or for extra credit, include a green dichromatic light that has special nerves from your retina to your pineal that helps regulate your hormonal neurochemical set points called homeostasis or self-regulation. And we used to walk around under a canopy of green. So if you can, right.
Your point is so well taken. We forget that for our eyes to rest, we need to look at a far distance. At a far distance, our eyes diverge, the lens flattens, and then we want to look at green and all the small details, like the appreciation of the trees or the hills far away. That really relaxes our eyes. So if you're lucky, and here the US is disastrous, and I mean that in office design, where many people are indoors, so their eyes can never look at a far distance because they look at the wall. And all typist offices, people did not have the typewriter in front of a wall. They could still look at the far distance. Now most people have their computer against the wall. So, which keeps the eyes focused, leading to stress. And I really mean that. I can show that. And alternate, look outside. I'm lucky I can do that. There's a tree there. And for a moment, just for a moment, after you've done your paragraph, take time to contemplate. Because what we really forget in this world where we are in a river of stimuli, one after the other, we no longer take time of our brain to really integrate and get an absent, a different point of view. Creativity occurs when you get lots of information in, and then you may not know what to cope with. You go for a walk through the woods, and all of a sudden something comes from left field that integrates it. And that is the part of all spiritual traditions as well, where you take time out to reflect in a very positive way without having to have the answers. And this part is lost. And I can see this, what happens to the brain, because when we watch If we watch streaming videos, we watch 1 hour episode, and then automatically the next one starts and the next one starts. And you are essentially conditioned, because our brain needs new stimuli, because it could be dangerous out there. It's very hard to interrupt. I call those all evolutionary traps. And I should tell a story on that. And that is on evolutionary traps, and we are not that different. And that's about the albatross. Those are these big birds who fly over the Pacific and the ocean, and they eat fish. And on Midway Island, which is thousands of miles away from any other island, you see the nests and the carcasses of the dead albatrosses. And you see thousands of dead albatrosses littering the beaches. And they have, all the flesh has been eaten up. And what is left is the skeleton, the feathers, and the content of their GI tract. It's all pieces of plastic.
Oh.
Because what happened is, when an albatross flies over the ocean, it sees something shimmering in the water, the age of plastics. That would be fish. They would eat it, ingest it. They would bring it back either to their chicks, or they would ingest it for themselves. Now they fly, they see something very similar, because that's where this whole gyres of plastic part pieces are. They now go into the water, they take it, and it tastes very similarly because of the algae growing on it. They swallow it or later regurgitate it, except it's not food. And now you see this die-off of the albatrosses. That is called an evolutionary trap, because these albatrosses, for survival, had learned that shimmering in the water, whatever that is fish. And the ones who did that best would survive and lay more eggs. Now that same mechanism leads to death. In not too bad extreme way, what you talked about food earlier. In the last 50 years, with our highly processed, unnurtured foods, from my perspective, with Roundup or glyphosate built into it, all these are foods which are designed so we like it. So we go to the supermarket, there's the candy bar, sugar. Yes, we want fats in sugar. We need them, because they are energy sources we would not have survived. We have no mechanisms to intrinsically say no. Should we now blame the child who wants that candy, when basically it's fulfilling its biological evolutionary drive, in a sense, to find nourishment? Or should we be blaming our agro business that is exploiting these mechanisms for sales? And I think I have a strong bias. I would say the same thing for media. That we are
my children, who are 30-something and have survived their parents, Rebecca and I chose to let them breastfeed until they were ready to wean. At that point, we would sit at the table and they would reach for something, and we had a little grinder, and we ground up some of that, and they would smear it around and make an artistic array, and some of it would get in their mouth. And so we never had to buy what today have been found to be baby foods with heavy toxic metals like lead and mercury and cadmium. We didn't have to worry about these addictive, crave factor inducing processed foods that really, we used to be feast or famine. Now it's feast to feast to feast to feast. We're overfed and undernourished, but it's a choice. Fortunately, today, if you choose to change what you acquire, what you bring into your home, and I, like anybody else, at 2 o'clock in the morning, if I'm up and hungry, I'm going to probably nibble on whatever is the least healthy thing at home. So the least healthy thing we have here are seeds and nuts. There's no Snickers. You can look, but there won't be any. And so I think we have to wean ourselves away from these addictions, these visual, these gustatory, these processing, these environmental. We're marinating in a sea of chemicals. We're taking in more and more anti-nutrients and less of the good nutrients. Well, as Mel Brooks, as the 2,000-year-old man used to say, don't do that. And your point, I just want to reinforce your point one more way. Today, in much of the world, the rice contains microplastic particles and arsenic. A double whammy. And you might like chicken, the chicken might like you, but the chicken's got the arsenic. And increasingly, we find in animals that are higher on the food chain that they're more contaminated with the bad stuff, that they have less of the good stuff and more of the bad stuff because of just what you said, our commercial priorities rather than our health priorities in regard to what we eat and drink, what we think and do.
Yeah, for me, this really demands not, we tend to put this as individual choice, which I think we do have some of it, but, and in reality, it is really, we have been exploited for the financial dollar because those foods are cheaper. And then for many people, they have very few options because their parents were brainwashed by advertising. Just like we said, smoking is good for you. No different. We say Coca-Cola is great. You know, all those kind of ads. I'm using these two labels. They can be any foods almost. But if you really start saying, wait a minute, organic food, which, a sweet potato is very healthy, but it gets no advertising because no one can make money on it. And that, I'm sorry, that takes government, state regulations, for
And
that same part.
education and a makeover in the kitchen so that it's relatively easy to work with whole foods like a sweet potato. And by the way, white potatoes, forget about it. Yams and sweet potatoes and tubers and so forth and squash, actually, they can be delicious and easy, but it is for most of us a makeover. In many
Yes.
schools today, when the parents want whole foods for the lunch meals or the meals of the school, they're told that there is no stove. There's only a microwave and a freezer.
Well, it's
So
even worse.
Really, yeah, yes, it is.
It's much worse. Because the USDA supplies the foods to the schools often at low. And it's the real key is it health for the child. It is sort of a circular thing. Kids like pizza, therefore you give them pizza, versus saying we need to have a cultural reset to realize that food, if you look at your hand, when I look at my own hand, I have to realize every cell in my body, every part of my body is the result of the food I ate. And the way I often think about it, if you build a house and you build it with second-rate materials, then it's going to not last long. If you build a house with first-rate materials, then it doesn't always mean it will last long. It still can get an earthquake or something like that. But the odds are it will last much longer. And that includes us. If I think of our bodies, it is the food we eat, but also our life patterns. So to summarize one more time, adjust your ergonomics, that's your environment. There are many guidelines for it. 2, for the computer, take many breaks, especially eye breaks. Keep looking away for a moment or do palming techniques. There are many of those. Look at the book by Meyer Schneider called Vision for Life. Then be sure you change your diet and get up a lot. And then be aware that thoughts and emotions are as powerful as they are drugs for our bodies. You can use them to heal and you can use them to harm. And what I ended up saying earlier about posture, we're unaware. So one of the devices we use, for example, again, I have no financial interest in this. We use a device called an Upright Go, which is a little device you put in your spine. It runs on your cell phone. And then when I slouch, it vibrates. It tells me, get up. And when we have done this in our research studies, it's most impressive. It reminds people, oh, I've slouched. Maybe, why do I slouch? I'm tired. I have hopeless thoughts. I cross my legs for women often. They cross their legs, you automatically collapse like that. There are a few others. I had to go to the screen more to see. But once you identify that, then you have the option to start changing it. And we teach those. You can do, if you're tired, get up, walk around for a moment. Go outside, be in the trees or whatever, if that's possible. If you have negative thoughts, sometimes some simple cognitive reframing. You don't have to do the work. You don't have to do homework. You're choosing to do it. You can choose not to go to school. It's the shift of powerlessness to empowerment. They're very simple, but these tools are, in our perspective, are really useful. So finally, I would recommend, and and that we put much of this together in our book called Techstress, How Technology is Hijacking Our Lives and Strategies for Coping and Pragmatic Ergonomics. And I would say, I would look at that. It gives the evolutionary perspective, but it offers really some of these pragmatic concepts we have talked about today, which I think, my gosh, when you do that, you find there is life after 5.
And we will add links so that folks can pursue any of the subjects that you've so eloquently and elegantly articulated. Pleasure to have this DocTalk time with you. Thank you, Jayashri. Thank you, Dr. Pepper. And may we all be well and happy knowing that choice does matter, that we can choose a life well chosen and well lived, in which case we can not be bound by the errors and traumas of the past. And this is a classic Buddhist metaphor. If you live in the past, you'll get depressed. If you live in the future, you'll get anxious. How about the third way? Live in the moment. It's a radical shift for most of us who were taught to live in our heads or live somewhere other than in the moment, to be in the moment. And if you want an example, look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama, with all the challenges, having to flee his country in 1959. He remains joyful, he remains alive and well, despite what has been a torrent of stress pointed at him by, say, the folks who took over Tibet. And for full disclosure, he is my daughter's godfather, and he is, in my opinion, an example, as he points out, of how to choose to live a life well lived, a life where your, quote, priorities, he would even say his religion, is kindness and compassion. And if that's too long, he'll start with compassion and he may not have to get too much further than that. So thank you for being yourself. Thank you for doing all the work you have done to remind us that we can make a difference, that we can choose life, that the feedback we give ourselves is important, and we can do that in ways that enable, enrich, and empower us.
Thank you so much, Russ, for inviting me to share some of the concepts. Look forward to many more discussions.
Thank you both. Most enlightening. Thank you.